Hey there! Happy Wednesday afternoon. I'm excited to join you today. I actually was planning this live video yesterday and it was my 3-year-old niece's party. I was baking cupcakes. I got behind and completely was unable to do it. So here I am today and very, very glad to join you on this most interesting topic of the Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, which I had not heard of until I heard from Katherine and Jaimy about this idea. So I see Katherine joining us. Thank you for bringing this up. And then, of course, I had to dive into the literature. So I'm going to share an article that just came out this week, and I actually have it all up here in front of me, all highlighted. I'll put it in our newsletter for this week. So if you're a therapist on our newsletter, I'll send out a link to the article. If you're a patient as well, I'll send it out in our patient newsletter that goes out next Monday. But first of all, if we haven't met, my name is Julie Hirschberg. I'm a neurologic physical therapist. So passionate about the brain and all of the interesting things that can occur when wiring goes awry is kind of what I think about. And this development of Alice in Wonderland Syndrome and depersonalization, derealization is one of those things. And yes, Katherine, you're going to love this article. I was thinking about you the whole time I was reading it. This article is called How Vestibular Dysfunction Transforms into Symptoms of Depersonalization and Derealization. I'm going to dive into the article, but I want to just give you a little backdrop. So let me just share my screen. I took a little screenshot during our otolith webinar, so there's lots happening on here. Oh my gosh, and it's so tiny, but I wish you could see this. Hopefully you can kind of see the slide here. This was our otolith mixtape webinar that Katherine and Jaimy did. It's actually not available at the moment. We're kind of redoing the website for it, so to be continued. But this is where I first heard of this. It was from Jaimy and Katherine, and it was otolith dysfunction correlated with depersonalization and derealization and this Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Now, so that's the whole background. That's what kind of led me down this rabbit hole of vestibular and depersonalization, derealization. So I wanted to give that background and wanted to give the shout out to Katherine and Jaimy for hooking me in to this interesting idea, because I see it in patients and I didn't really understand it. So maybe you have heard the term Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. And when I think about it, I have another picture here. Let's see. This was actually from the article that Jaimy and Katherine cited, a couple of the original pictures from Alice in Wonderland, where you can see her body expanding, or you can see her body really tiny next to the cat. And really what Alice in Wonderland Syndrome is, it reflects a lot of what Alice experiences, is this disruption in self-perception and how your body is perceiving, or how your brain is perceiving your body. And most often when I hear from folks where they might be experiencing this is like a disconnect, or their head is floating, or their head is really big, or they're off axis, or just even they don't even know what's real anymore. There's a lot of different ways that I've heard this. Disconnection is probably the most common that I've heard, and it's this depersonalization or unreality, derealization. And what Katherine and Jaimy shared in their webinar was that this study that showed it was correlated with otolith dysfunction and the processing, so brain processing of the sensory integrative information from our vestibular system, our visual system, and our sensory systems. So then I read that article that they shared, was very intrigued, and then I went down the rabbit hole. So I went on to read other articles. So I want to share this article that I ran into. Oh, I just noticed the sound change for me. Will you let me know that you can still hear me? Because sometimes when the sound changes, the sound goes away. So if you can give me a little heads up that you can still hear me, that would be great. If you can't hear me, we might have to restart. So just let me know. You can just put that in the comments. I'll watch the comments here before I keep going. Okay, thank you. Colores Vivos. I love that name, and thank you very much for giving me the the thumbs up. And oh, Catherine, you're so right, so appropriate. Going down rabbit holes in Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I go down rabbit holes of curiosities all the time, and maybe that's actually why I loved that movie. I found it very strange, but I love this idea of kind of following your curiosities and seeing where it takes you. And when it comes to the brain, there are so many curiosities to follow, but this idea of depersonalization, derealization, the vestibular system, it's a big one. So this article, 2023 Journal of Neurologic Sciences, the first author is Elosef, I think is how you might say that. It's a group out of Israel, and how vestibular dysfunction transforms into symptoms of depersonalization and derealization. This is a very interesting study that they did. So let me tell you what they did first, and then talk about this 3-step. This is kind of the how they put in the discussion section how this might happen. But first, they found that it did happen. So they looked at, compared two groups, a group that had bilateral vestibular hypofunction. So if that term is new to you, that is decreased vestibular function in both ears. And then they compared that to central vestibular dysfunction, and they used a degenerative disease of the cerebellum and bilateral vestibular pathways. So they did this because they hypothesized it would be different, that we might not see some of the otolith dysfunction or the depersonalization and derealization in a central vestibular disorder, which I found very interesting, because indeed they did not find that in central vestibular disorders. So what did they test? They what they tested to get at the otolith versus the semicircular canals was doing some standard testing that people typically might get done at an ENT, which is a video head impulse test, and that tests the semicircular canal function. Then they did a test that we have talked about with other colleagues, we feel like doesn't get done enough, and that's a VEMP. I always forget exactly what that stands for. So it's a vestibular evoked myogenic potentials test. And in that test is testing more otolith function. Much more common for people to have canals tested. So when they go for testing, vestibular testing from an ENT, they typically have the canals tested, but not the otoliths. And in this particular study, they tested both so that they could look at which was more correlated to depersonalization and derealization. So and then they looked at self-reported measures. And actually, I was really intrigued by these measures. So body sensation questionnaire was one of them. Object perspective taking test, which tests some of the spatial awareness that we often see is impaired in otolith dysfunction as well. And one other, there was the Cox-Swinson depersonalization, derealization inventory. Also something I hadn't heard of before. So these might be helpful ways to test and assess this, by the way. Whenever I read these, I think of like 5 more tests, then 5 more self-report measures that we could be giving patients, which is totally overwhelming, but important so that they could see the relationship of the extent of a person's depersonalization or derealization and the objective vestibular findings. So, what did they find? So first, they found that people with bilateral vestibular hypofunction, not surprisingly, had significant semicircular canal, so their video head impulse test. So they had decreased semicircular canal function, dysfunction of the saccules tested in the VEMP testing, increased spatial disorientation, elevated anxiety, and more depersonalization, derealization symptoms. Let's see. So in the central disorders, there's a lot of complexity to this study. In the central disorder, they did have semicircular canal hypofunction, but no dysfunction in the otoliths. That makes some sense. And none of the spatial orientation or depersonalization and derealization. So the central vestibular dysfunction did not include that. So with these relationships, what they concluded is that the depersonalization, derealization actually is associated with the otolith dysfunction. And it can be either with the semicircular canals or without it. So you don't have to have semicircular canal dysfunction to experience these symptoms. And it was not developing in central vestibular dysfunction. So they proposed, and I found this very, very helpful, this 3-step. How does this occur? So again, this is the title of the paper. How vestibular dysfunction transforms into depersonalization and derealization. There's a physiologic cause here, and I think this is what is so important. So first, you get the vestibular otolithic function perturbed. They tested it in patients with bilateral vestibular hypofunction, but we know otolith function is perturbed in many other things. We see it post-concussion, for example. We see it in vestibular migraine. So this could be due to many reasons. Again, in this study, bilateral vestibular hypofunction, but we know it could be many other things. So they propose first, this function is perturbed. Then, due to the connections from the otolith through the brainstem, cerebellum, and to the central processing, this triggers spatial disorientation, and it directly triggers anxiety. That's not necessarily a behavioral response, but certainly you could imagine the spatial disorientation and the dizziness would cause anxiety, but there's actually a direct physiological connection that causes anxiety. And I think this is so important because I talk to people and they're like, I didn't think I was anxious, and then this just kind of came up. Well, yeah, it was triggered in the brain because that's where all of this lives. And then number 3 is that abnormal perceptions, that's this percepts, emerge, and they're classified, again, in the brain, because this is what it does to save energy, as derealization and depersonalization. So very interesting. Now, I want to give you a couple of pieces that they shared in the article that I thought were really, really helpful. And again, I highlighted so many things in the article. And this is where they supported a couple of their pieces of literature. So in this 3-stage model, what they said was that otolith dysfunction is expected to generate spatial disorientation and anxiety because of the direct connections. And get this, the direct connections are to the temporal parietal junction, which we know is implicated in a lot of other complex functional neurologic disorders, and hippocampus. So also associated with memory, right, and executive function. And they say, so that's supported by a couple of papers, and it interferes with the central processes that we investigate as physical therapists really often of multisensory integration. And I love that they use this term, because this is something that Katherine and Jaimy talk a lot of, is how these sensory pieces are integrated together. They go on to say the otoliths are the primary direct sensors of gravitational forces. Yes, we've been learning that. Thank you, Jaimy and Katherine. And when it comes to multisensory integration, that gravitational information is integrated with our visual system and the proprioceptive input from our body. And those pieces together give us a true perception of upright, verticality, posture, etc. And so this serves as a reference to the relative of the environment around us. And I see Katherine say, yes, this is not new to Katherine. She's been teaching me all these pieces. What I love is that, like, literally, that is what they are sharing from this great article from out of Israel. And so it so correlates. This is not just, the otolith club, people that love the otolith. Like, this is being tested and confirmed. So what they talk about here, again, I'm reading you some quotes from the article, that in folks with vestibular disorders, you get this distortion of true and relative upright, an impairment of spatial perception and self-perception. And there's a mismatch then. So there's a mismatch between your currently impaired perceptions and the past normal perceptions that they have. You could imagine this making you feel like Alice in Wonderland. So there's a mismatch, there's a distortion, and that can feel like things aren't real. That can feel like your body isn't your own. And that is not just an emotional response. I think sometimes it really can be interpreted that way. And this is a physiologic response. The other thing that I love that they share in the discussion is that the otolith dysfunction can directly induce anxiety right into those distinct pathways, again, that Jaimy and Katherine have chatted about, because it has a direct link with the autonomic nervous system, cardiovascular and respiratory autonomic responses. And so changing of those can lead to a direct sensation of anxiety. And again, that is a very physiological response that can occur from otolith dysfunction. So what they summarize is this otolith dysfunction with the subsequent changes in abnormality of limbic and autonomic profile can lead directly to anxiety. And you combine that with spatial disorientation, and you get Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. You get the experience of depersonalization and derealization. And often I think when a person experiences those things, they think it's all in their head. They think there's something wrong with how they are functioning mentally. Now, it is in the head, not it's in the brain, but there's a physiologic brain response. And while I think it is very important in a lot of these disorders to have a mental health component, if we ignore the physiologic, vestibular, and more specifically, otolith component, we're missing a big piece of the picture, because we can, as therapists, assess and treat otolith dysfunction. And we can then change these sensations of depersonalization, derealization, spatial orientation, cognitive effects, all of those things that can be down the line of the otolith dysfunction. And I am definitely a part of the otolith club. I'm definitely a part of, like, let's test it, let's treat it, let's not assume that this Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, or when a person experiences depersonalization or derealization, that is entirely a mental health issue. Of course, there are things that can also cause that can also be a trauma response, but let's test the vestibular system. Let's test the otoliths. Let's treat it. And as physical therapists, we're not going to be doing the VEMP. We're not going to be doing that diagnostic test. We can certainly refer and ask somebody to do it, but we have great ways to clinically assess and treat this. And that is, like, for the past few weeks, we've been nonstop talking about this with Jaimy and Katherine and their courses. I've learned what I have from them. They're two neurologic physical therapists, vestibular specialists that have quite honestly been way ahead of the curve in understanding this in terms of the otolith. So I am so thankful for that. And I'm thankful for the world of therapists that have joined us in the otolith club in understanding this really under-assessed and under-treated part of the vestibular system. So again, I'm going to share this article. I will put a link in our newsletter this week. If you're a physical therapist, join us at reactiveeducation.com and hop on our newsletter. I send it out every Friday with our videos, with links to papers and resources for you. I'll send it out this week. And if you're a patient looking to dive deeper, heck, you send your therapist a video. I think they will thank you. But you can also join our newsletter. We have one specifically going out to you. It goes out on Mondays, and you can join at reactivept.com. And I always include all of our videos and resources and literature in there too. Catherine says, thank you for spreading the love of the otoliths. I want to say thank you to Catherine for teaching us all about the otoliths so that we can really dive deeper with our patients and understand some of those symptoms a little bit better. So thank you so much for being on this journey of learning with me, for tolerating all my curiosities and jumping down that rabbit hole with me. I really appreciate that so much. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much.